Hello everyone and welcome back to the bench. If you know my channel then you'll know I am an Armour modeler, which is why I'm excited today to bring you the second video of me building this Swiss BF109 from Tamiya. Last episode we tackled the cockpit, adding some extra PE and printed details for this Swiss variant, and today we're going to close up the fuselage and complete the rest of the assembly. If that sounds good to you then stick around. I definitely made a few mistakes and learned a few things from this stage of the project, so it should make for an interesting watch. But let's get into the video, and after closing up the two halves of the body we could wave goodbye to most of our work in the cockpit from last video. We could also wave goodbye to the start of this build going smoothly, as I seemingly forgot that Tamiya Extra Thin is extra thin and is designed to run into recesses and cracks. I managed to get fingerprints on both sides of the body from squeezing these parts together while gluing them. Wonderful. I gave our glue some time to bond to the two halves properly, and then I came back with varying grit sanding sponges and tidied up the seams along the length of this plane. Overall there wasn't any issue with how these parts lined up, and so I only had to use sanding. No putty here. Thankfully, my fingerprints were also pretty shallow, so they buffed out with some sanding here too. I did spend a lot of time sanding at this step, but I'm not 100% sure if that's because the kit demanded it, or because I've just heard that's what plane builders do and I was trying to channel that energy on this 109. I do also know that there should be a seam along the length of the 109, exactly where I just sanded a seam away. But I'd prefer to make an intentional seam than leave an accidental one, so I went back in with a scribing tool to add this back in, using a piece of tape as a guide. I was as careful as possible here. Scribing stresses me out and I try to make light, careful lines to begin with before deepening them with subsequent passes. I did still slip a few times here and there, but those scratches were easily filled with putty later on. With that done, we could glue our first part to this kit in the form of this pop-out piece next to the engine. I did check my references before sticking this intake on though, because the Swiss BF109 E3s had a number of differences to their German counterparts, many of which are visible on this nose area. If you missed my last video, we discovered that the Tamiya Swiss boxing contains markings for a Swiss 109, but not the parts to build one up correctly. For that reason I designed and printed my own detail parts, like these two blister pieces in front of the canopy, which I'm now dropping into place with superglue. These will replace the U-shaped blister on the engine cover, and they accommodate the replacement Swiss armaments, MG29s in place of the German MG17s. Could I have just used milliput or similar putty to recreate these? Technically probably yes, but I opted for the printing route to ensure that both were exactly the same shape and size on each side here. I could then blend them out using some putty to smooth the transition a little better. I masked the canopies off camera by covering them in masking tape and cutting around the edges, so I decided to spray the interior grey over these parts now so that I could focus on the rest of the plane. Using some UV resin, I tried to stick our clear parts into place. Regular plastic cement or superglue would risk fogging up these clear parts, so I decided to find an alternative solution here, and I'd heard about using UV cure resin in the past. This worked pretty well, but honestly I think I'll stick to something like Yoo-hoo in the future. The parts were stuck, but I just don't fully trust them. Once the front and back parts were in place, I wedged a sponge into the middle gap because I do intend on posing the canopy open, so I'm leaving it off until pretty much everything else is built and painted. This is a pretty straightforward kit. There's actually only two main plastic sprues plus the clear parts, so it's no surprise that it was quickly time to add our wings. The wings are comprised of three main parts, and I did find the sprue gates on these parts pretty odd. Some of them connect directly to the leading edge of the wing, which requires some careful cleanup to keep the curve consistent and even. Most of this cleanup was just done with my hobby blade, and I was soon able to glue these parts together. This was once again a job for the extra thin, and I dropped a dot of glue onto each of the locating pins across the left hand wing first. I dropped the part into place and pressed the parts together with one hand while adding some more glue into the seam to ensure a good bond. Look familiar? Yep, this is video evidence of me making the exact same mistake I made on the fuselage and left yet another gluey fingerprint on the plastic surface. I did manage to avoid making this mistake on the other side, so maybe we're learning. Once the glue dried, I came back with my trusty sanding sticks to polish the seam along the leading edge and the sides. Even with good fitment across this kit, there was still a decent bit of work to be done here to disguise the join of these parts. Next came the tail rudder, I believe that's what it's called, and it has some handy tabs to locate it into position on the rear of the plane. It took some fiddling to get it straight. I think this is one of those parts that might be a noticeable mistake if it's even a tiny bit off. Similarly, the tail wings are pretty important to get square, and they have a diagonal strut to help that happen. I still can't actually tell if mine went in straight. Most of the time they look good, but then all of a sudden I look at it from a certain angle and they look pretty wonky. They're both straight and not straight at the same time, like Schrodinger's Messerschmitt. Remember how I told you that Tamiya Swiss 109 kit doesn't build into a Swiss 109? Well, the guns in the wings are another one of those errors, and so I designed and printed some replacements, printed them on my resin printer so they had that iconic cone-shaped end. I'm certainly not an experienced 3D designer, but I was pretty chuffed with how these parts just dropped right into place, and they really do look the part. The guns in the nose are also wrong, but fixing them is a tiny bit more involved than the drag and drop wing replacements. The kit barrels come mounted on their own little block at the staggered position, like you'd see in German planes, but the Swiss use different weapons and they should both be in line with each other. For that reason, I carefully snipped away the German barrels to replace them with some more printed parts. We've installed the Swiss blisters and guns in the nose now, so the final part of this trilogy epic is to get rid of the U-shaped German blister from the engine cover part. This was carefully done with the Dremel. At least the Dremel did most of the heavy lifting before some fine grit sanding sponges made sure that the transitions and textures were smooth on this part. It will be front and center in the end after all. After that I decided to once again hold the parts together while using Tamiya Extra Thin, but I guess the modelling gods were bored of watching me sand away my own fingerprints because I actually got lucky and I avoided that hassle on this occasion. It was pretty much as soon as this part went on that I could really recognise the 109's iconic shape, and I can assure you that the engine noises and pretending to fly the plane around were barreling their way down the tracks towards me. Also barreling towards me was the sudden realisation that the ResKit exhaust replacements for the Wingsy kit 109 E3s really are for the Wingsy kit, not the Tamiya one. They did not fit in the angled slot on my version of this plane, and at this point I had to decide if I was going to try to thin down the upgrade parts and risk breaking them, or put them into the spares box and settle with the inferior detail of the Tamiya one. While pondering this predicament, I decided to drill out the cover for the ends of these parts to bring my model in line with the references I had to hand. These holes should really follow the shape of this exhaust cover end, as it looks like a thin piece of metal bent in reality, but any hole at the end of this is going to make a difference. With that done, and in a detail boosting mood, I decided to thin down the resin parts using the Dremel and files until it fit. I guess I also decided not to film that, or otherwise lost that footage, which really ruins this whole narrative section of the script, but just imagine everything going great and exactly to plan. Back to our Swissification of this plane, and it was time to add the tiniest little rounded triangular shape on the side of the fuselage behind the cockpit, a late war Swiss addition, which was a ventilation outlet for battery gases added to all Swiss Amils during the war. This was another one of the 3D printed parts, and I've left a link to where you can get all of those files in the description below if you want to build one of these yourself. We're a good chunk of the way through the build now as well, so if you're enjoying the video, please give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. The channel is constantly growing, and if this project does well, I'll probably do another plane soon in the future. Now, with the wings finally glued in place on the fuselage, we had something that really looked like a plane. If any of you guys are plane builders, does there come a point when you stop pretending to fly them around, or is that just human instinct or immaturity kicking in? One quirk of the 109 are these leading edge slats, which automatically extended to improve low speed handling or for landing. These can be posed in the extended position in this kit, but I couldn't find too many references where they were like that, especially not on the ground, so I decided to glue them closed. I'm also not sure if this was my mistake or intentional in the kit, but these slats are not flush with the leading edge of the rest of the wing. I may have caused this during sanding earlier on as well, but the panel lines are still visible in these areas, so I don't really know if this is even an issue. I was tempted to sand the slats back to blend it all together, but ultimately decided to just leave it as it's pretty subtle overall. The flaps themselves each had a big triangular bulge to glue onto the underside, and they can also be positioned either down or straight. I opted to go for flaps down in the end because they make things a little more dynamic, and they'll give the opportunity for some of the underside blue to be visible on the top when we get to painting in the next video. I'm also going to leave these parts off for now because I think they'll be easiest to paint separately and then glue everything together once it's painted. At this stage there was still a massive gaping hole below the engine, so it was time to assemble the lower cowling. This was made up of a frankly shocking number of pieces, many of which will never be seen, including our final PE part from Edward that I superglued into place. I was tempted to paint all of this before installing it onto the plane, but after dry fitting I realised that it's all going to be totally invisible and I could better just spend my time elsewhere. There was also some radiators on the undersides of the wings, and I noticed that there was a round vertical strut in the centre of the radiator cover panels on my references, and that's an easy little detail to add. I simply drilled holes in both the underside of the wing and on the cover piece, and then cut some wire to length and fixed it with some superglue before gluing everything together. That pretty much made up all of the main body assembly, so I did a quick pass with some filler to clean up some seams and some gaps that were a little too obvious for my liking. I'm using Deluxe Perfect Plastic Putty, and I really like this stuff because it can be thinned with water and sands quite well once it's dry too. Once it's been applied for a few minutes, I often like to come back with a damp brush to remove any of the excess, which helps get rid of some of the texture and means that we'll have less work sanding or polishing later on. Pretty much the final step on this build with the landing gear, each made up of two pieces with a tab that slots into place under the wings to make sure they sit in the correct position. Such position is oddly both forwards and outwards and looks pretty unnatural overall, but it matches the references. Once again, I did add my own little touch to these pieces, adding a few extra tubes and wires as seen in some of the pictures, but these will likely never be noticed. And with that, we have a completed build. At least we have a build that is as complete as it's going to get until after most of the painting steps are completed in the next video. Let me tell you, there were a lot of highs and lows in the painting process of this one, so please do subscribe if you don't want to miss it. I really enjoyed this kit so far, and to be honest, I think I got really lucky with the kit that I chose. You really can't go wrong with Tamiya kits. Any of the problems on this build were pretty much my own fault. I also think this is probably my first time specifically designing upgrade or replacement parts for a kit, and overall I think they went really well and make the difference in selling this 199 as a Swiss one. Is there anything you think I missed or should have done differently on this build? Please let me know in the comments, and let me know if you've either built this kit or built one of its close relatives in the past. I know BF109s are a very popular subject. With that, I'd like to thank you for watching and supporting the channel, and I hope you're enjoying 2026 so far. With that, I'll roll the slideshow, and I'll see you in the next one.